Good day. Over the recent weeks, certain Western companies, notably H&M and Nike, have been finding it increasingly difficult to access the giant Chinese market, as they have found themselves drawn into the battle over the use of cotton from China's western regions, specifically Xinjiang province, where there are claims on the part of Western governments of horrific human rights abuses and of even the practice of genocide. I'm going to say what I have said previously when this topic comes up, that I don't have direct access to Xinjiang province. I don't know anybody there. I've read the various reports that are published by various people, but I am not in a position to take an independent view on what is actually happening in Xinjiang province. What this program is about is not about what is going on in Xinjiang province. It is about the Chinese boycott and sanctioning of these large Western companies, H&M and Nike, which now find themselves being driven out or pushed out of the giant Chinese market. By the way, H&M and Nike, to my knowledge, are not the only companies which find themselves in this same situation. I was recently talking to a person who works for another Western company, I'm not going to specify which one, which apparently has been having to assess the situation in a similar way. Now, what makes this really an interesting situation for me is not that the Chinese are responding in this way, but the Western reaction. And there has been an editorial in the Financial Times, London's Financial Times, a rigidly Atlanticist newspaper nowadays, which for me captures the spirit of this extremely well. The editorial starts with the following words. Its title is "China Forces Brands to Make a Cotton Choice. Action Against H&M and Nike Shows Intolerance of Scrutiny Over Xinjiang." And then we read from the body of the editorial the following. The disappearance of H&M, one of the world's largest clothing retailers, from e-commerce and ride-hailing apps in China last week marks an escalation in the diplomatic battle over cotton from Xinjiang. China has shown that it will not just encourage local consumer boycotts of global brands that reject Xinjiang cotton, but will impose them. China is enraged by governments and civil society groups drawing attention to its human rights abuses against more than 1 million Uyghurs and minorities in Xinjiang. It is acting aggressively against textile and fashion companies that publicly eliminate sourcing from Xinjiang, which provides about 20% of the world's cotton. Companies such as H&M and Nike have been caught awkwardly between political pressure from the US and Europe and Chinese denunciation of malicious lies about the situation in Xinjiang. The words malicious lies in the editorial are placed in quotation marks, either to show that it is a quotation from things the Chinese authorities have said, or that it is something that the Financial Times itself doubts are malicious lies, probably both. Until now, H&M and Nike and other such companies have kept on growing retail operations in China while diversifying their supply chains. As China makes this balancing act harder, they will be forced to take a clearer stance. And then the Financial Times editorial goes on to lament the present situation. China is in a powerful position given the growing importance of its consumer market to global brands and retailers. Nike's sales in Greater China in the quarter to February outstripped those in North America. Note the use of the word Greater China. It has a considerable lever to pull against what Chinese Central Television, the broadcaster, last week called unruly companies with no business ethics that seek to earn a huge profit in China. Now, to my mind, it is the last paragraph that actually captures the fundamental issue, because the reality is that what the Chinese are doing is something that the United States and Western governments have done repeatedly ever since the end of the Second World War. This is to coerce companies and businesses to sever trade links or to shape their commercial policies according to the political wishes of the United States and of other Western governments. In the event that those businesses and companies do not do that, then they have been repeatedly and continuously threatened with exclusion from the US's vast consumer market, and also with restrictions on on US-dominated payments systems. I'm just going to cite one example of many, though though many others could spring to mind. I'm going to go to the site of a small company in Britain known as the Algerian Coffee Stores, which is located in the central area of Soho, and which provides a mail order system supplying people with quality coffees, teas, and other such products. I should say this is a very old, well-established business in Britain with its roots going far into the 19th century. Well, you find on the website a reference to Cuban coffee, and you also find this large notice attached to it. The United States government has recently placed broad restrictions on the purchase or sale of various goods and services originating from or being shipped to Cuba. And although this restriction is for US customers only, they will no longer allow us to use PayPal as a payment method if we do not remove the Cuban item from our website. And presumably that is what they're going to do. So there you are. There's an example of the United States putting pressure on companies, restricting in effect their trade choices, their commercial choices to reflect US policies. The US would say, in the case of Cuba, that this is related to Cuban human rights violations. Others would say that it is a political issue for the United States, and that the United States has been waging a long-running feud with Cuba going all the way back to the late 1950s, when Fidel Castro and his revolutionary movement gained power there. So that's just one example. As I said, one can think of so many others. Last year, for example, the United States escalated sanctions against the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which the Russians and the Germans have been building to supply natural gas from Russia to Germany. It's not, by the way, alleged that there are any human rights violations pertaining to that particular pipeline project. There's no suggestion that the workers, highly trained, highly skilled, and highly paid as they are, who work on or will operate that pipeline, are themselves the subject of human rights violations. Nonetheless, the United States has slapped sanctions on European companies which participate in the project, and as a result, some of them have pulled out of it. The United States did that shortly before with respect to companies, European companies specifically, that wanted to trade with Iran. When the United States pulled out of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was intended to limit Iran's nuclear program, it made it very clear that European companies that wanted to continue trading with Iran would face secondary sanctions from the United States if they did so. And as a result, all sorts of European companies, Daimler-Benz and the rest, decided to pull out of Iran because they were not prepared to risk secondary sanctions from the United States and were not prepared to put themselves in a position where they might lose or access to the giant US market. It's something, as I have said, that the United States has done repeatedly and consistently ever since the Second World War. Now, it's not, therefore, entirely surprising that China, which now has a consumer market comparable to that of the United States, is borrowing a leaf from America's book and is starting to do the same. Now, I'm going to, before I proceed further, just say what China says about the question of human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And I want to make it very clear that this relates specifically to the cotton fields, and it also discusses and takes head on some of the points which are made in the Financial Times editorial that we've been talking about. It says this, and I again want to stress this is the Chinese view. I'm not saying it's true. I don't know one way or the other. The big lie, this is from Global Times, the big lie that cotton in Xinjiang is produced through forced labour does not stand up to the on-site inspections, as up to 75% of Xinjiang's cotton is harvested by machine. Xinjiang is quickly becoming one of the most advanced cotton producing regions in the world. So where is the room for forced labour? The accusations the US and Europe have made against Xinjiang can be argued as imaginations. The difference between China and those countries is like the difference between a gentleman and a villain. Well, that's the way the Chinese talk about this. And by the way, they say, and this takes again, seems to respond to the Financial Times point, anyone who visits Xinjiang will receive unrestricted access under international norms, and they will be able to see the real Xinjiang with their own eyes. In other words, the Chinese appear to be saying that they're prepared to allow inspections of the cotton fields in Xinjiang. That may be true, it may be not. I'm not saying one way or the other. But the fact is that they are now in a position to impose the same kind of restrictions on Western companies that the US has historically imposed on foreign companies, on other companies, if those companies do not do what China wants, and which the United States, when it does the same thing, imposes on companies which do not do what the United States wants. And I predict that this is going to continue and it's going to escalate. Not only does China now have a consumer market comparable in scale to the United States, but whereas the US market is essentially saturated, the Chinese market remains dynamic and continues to grow. Western companies which exclude themselves from the Chinese market because they follow political, or if you like, social media and civil society pressures are going from the West, are going to be significantly limiting their capacity to grow themselves commercially. That is going to be something many of them are going to find extremely difficult to do and to justify to their shareholders and investors. So I predict that over the next few weeks and months and perhaps years, there's going to be a tug of war within Western companies as they face countervailing pressures, commercial pressure from China to keep the links open to China, which might mean, for example, buying Xinjiang cotton, or accepting political and social pressure in the West to sever links with Xinjiang and with China, and not to buy Xinjiang cotton, and to run the risk in that case of losing access to the giant and dynamically growing Chinese market. Moreover, China today has an exceptionally diversified economy, and I have been told by those who should know that in every single case, Western companies that are pushed out of China find very quickly that their position within the Chinese market is replaced by Chinese companies which offer the same or a similar, or sometimes conceivably an even better service to their customers. So, loss of this market is usually or potentially permanent, and that is something that business executives in the West will be extremely reluctant to do. So, what is the summary of this program? Well, I did a program a short while ago in which I discussed at considerable length, how upset and angry people in Britain were when they discovered that if they campaigned against China because of what is going on, or what is supposedly or allegedly going on in Xinjiang, they might face sanctions from the Chinese. This is not something that the sort of activists, human rights advocates, lawyers, civil society campaigners, and those sort of people have ever had to face in that same way before, and it came as a real shock to them, and it caused considerable dismay and surprise in London. The same thing has now been done by the Chinese to similar activists and civil society advocates and lawyers and people like that in Canada, and apparently it's also been done to people in the United States too. Now we see that the Chinese are doing the same to Western companies that the West has routinely done to companies which do not follow its particular political and human rights agendas. And once again, we get that same sense of dismay. I mean, consider again the subtitle to that Financial Times article. Action against H&M and Nike shows Beijing's intolerance of scrutiny. And then we learn, we see all that powerful language being used about China. China is enraged by governments and civil society groups. It is acting aggressively against textile and fashion companies, and such like. Now, we don't, of course, see or hear or come across instances when, if the United States imposes sanctions on small businesses like the one I've just talked about, which tries to sell coffee, well, we don't hear about how that is an action by a government, a US government, which is enraged and which is acting aggressively. So this is a good example, it seems to me, once more, of how some people in the West are shocked, upset, dismayed, and astonished when the Chinese do to them what they themselves have been doing to so many people for so long. It's fine for the West, apparently, to impose sanctions, restrictions, systems of economic coercion against businesses which trade with countries or which take stances with which the West is unhappy and uncomfortable. But it's shocking, it's astonishing when the Chinese do the same. Nonetheless, that is indeed what is happening. And what makes this particularly offensive and horrifying from a Western point of view is that it's actually going to have an effect. That the West knows this is something that is confirmed once again by that Financial Times article. The outlook is clear, it goes on to say. China runs its economy as it wishes, and it will not tolerate attention being drawn to human rights infringements. It is forcing brands into choosing between social responsibility and sales to one of the world's biggest consumer markets. The silent treatment it has given to H&M is only the start of that test. It's horrifying what the Chinese are doing. We would never do such a thing, even though, of course, we do. It's fine for us to bully a small company that sends a small business that sells Cuban coffee. But it's horrifying. It's completely shocking when the Chinese do it to a big company like H&M. Moreover, because of the size of the Chinese market, because of the commercial imperative of selling to that market, there is the even greater horror and fear that maybe H&M will actually bend to what China wishes. Maybe companies like H&M and Nike, rather than lose forever their position in the Chinese market and be massively diminished in consequence, facing economic competition, commercial competition from companies that still trade with China that they cannot themselves match, maybe those companies will bend to what Beijing wants and will do as Beijing wishes. This, of course, underlines the key point about this affair. The United States, especially, but the West collectively in addition, has been able to engage in this kind of economic pressure on companies and businesses for a very long time without having to fear any significant consequences, and in the certain knowledge that companies will always bend to its will, because its own market has been far and away the biggest. No company trading around the world until now was prepared to risk exclusion from the market of the United States. Now, what the United States and Europe is encountering for the first time is that this same economic pressure is coming from a country, namely China, whose consumer market is comparable in scale and size to that of the United States, and which is growing even faster. The economic boot is now on the other foot, and the West doesn't like it at all. And as we see from that Financial Times article, they don't really know in the West what to do about it. To repeat the very last sentence of this Financial Times article, the silent treatment China has given to H&M is only the start of that test. There's no clear explanation or follow-up to that sentence. There's no way of explaining what companies like H&M and Nike should do in this kind of situation. Should they sacrifice their commercial future and possibly their long-term existence by doing what the West wants? Or should they persist in trading in China, buying, in this case, Xinjiang cotton, and in the consequence defying and enraging people in the West who feel that buying Xinjiang cotton is wrong and should stop. So, once more, we see the demonstration, the reality that the West finds itself in a situation where it is not, which it is not accustomed to. Up to now, for more than 70 years, since the end of the Second World War, it has felt itself able to strike these moralistic poses in the knowledge that no one would be able to do to the West what the West is doing to other countries. Now, with the rise of China, that has changed, and the West, for the first time, is getting a dose of its own medicine. It has no real response to this, it doesn't know what to do, and it is floundering. I'm afraid, just as I said in my previous program, where I discussed the sanctions that China has imposed on activists in the West will need to get used to the fact. The world where the US and the West imposed its ideas and values upon others and found that those others had no way to retaliate or respond or act in kind has now passed. We are in a different world from now, and this lesson needs to be learned fully and quickly in Western capitals. We will see if it will be. Thank you for joining me for this program. Please check us out, check me out on the other programs that we do on our other channel, our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check out Alex's channel and the new channel where we show the interactions with our viewers on our live streams. You'll find links under this video. Please check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey, which we have found to be an amazing channel. Please also check us out or support us if you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Please remember that we accept donations in all currencies, including all the new currencies such as Bitcoin. And please also look up our shop, look at the marvelous things you will find there, our wonderful magic mugs, our t-shirts, long sleeved and short sleeved, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, and last but not least, remember to check out also our Discord server and your subscription both to this channel and to our other channels. Thank you for joining me on this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our other channels, and have a wonderful day.